Hello there, men, and welcome to the Masculinism Movement channel, a place for men to be empowered in their masculinity in an anti-male age. I'm your host, Brian Crawl, and today I'm going to be mansplaining to you about sex addiction and simping, since it is actually a part of sex addiction, and like sex addiction, both of them are diseases. Yes, addiction is a disease. It is clinically recognized as such, and like most diseases and disorders, it generally doesn't get treated properly by the medical community. All too often, doctors just don't catch these kinds of diseases and disorders and diagnose them properly. It's difficult because different medical professionals will have different opinions on addiction. For instance, when I used to drink on the weekends when I was in my 20s, I had a counselor tell me I was an alcoholic and needed to go in for treatment just because I partied on the weekends. And I've even had counselors tell me I needed to sign up for a drug treatment program simply because I had used any drug, or in my case, weed, within the past couple of years. Like when I was signing up for therapy with a therapist and filling out the form, it would ask if you'd used any drugs in the past 2 years. And I'd say yes. And they'd say, okay, you need to go in for a treatment program. And so it seemed to me like it was just a grift, because if I wasn't currently using a drug, what exactly would a treatment program help me with? And obviously the program they'd sign me up for would be affiliated with their organization, and who knows what kind of kickbacks they'd get for referrals. And of course, drug rehab programs are highly lucrative, especially ones that consist mainly of group therapy, which most of them do, and which I put in quotes because it's not real therapy. It's not really therapeutic enough to qualify, all right? It is the least productive form of what is called therapy, where each client gets far less focus than they would in a one-on-one session, but yet it's far more profitable than one-on-one sessions. And addiction treatments and rehab programs are some of the most profitable forms of therapy. You see, addiction treatment services are just as much of a racket as drugs are, and most of the people offering it are making more money than the drug dealers themselves. However, though I've used drugs recreationally at times in my life and even struggled with addiction to a few of them, one thing that was a far greater addiction for me that lasted exponentially longer, yet which I was never diagnosed with, was sex addiction. Even when I would tell my counselors and medical professionals that saw me about my excessive sex life, they never addressed it. If they were female, they were more apt to react unprofessionally than helpfully. I remember one counselor that I had who literally flipped out at me and started like an argument saying, "Who do you think you are, Don Juan, or something? You're acting like you're God's gift to women," or something like that, just because I had told her that I was sleeping with multiple women and was polyamorous. She instantaneously was triggered and reacted like she was trying to have a verbal altercation with me over it. And I can only deduce that she must have been a feminist and got offended at what they call my womanizing. And there was also this one female nurse who had kind of an opposite reaction, who must have been attracted to me or something, right? Who told me when I was coming in very frequently for STD tests that I didn't need to come in so often for them, that it had only been a couple months since my last one, so I shouldn't need them so often. And so then I said, well, I've been sexually active with multiple partners since then. And she asked how many, and I told her over a dozen. And she suddenly looked stunned and then a bit depressed and dejected. And she was kind of just like, oh, well, okay then, I'll get the test. And I was like, oh shit, what the fuck kind of reaction is that? She acted like almost hurt over it. And it's just so weird and unprofessional that these women who are supposed to be medical professionals who are here to help me with such things would respond in such a way and never even address the topic of sex addiction. And either of these strong, independent female medical professionals could have had a much more productive conversation with me about the dangers of sex addiction and of unprotected sex, at least, but yet they didn't. And in retrospect, I can't help but wonder why that was. Aside from them being obviously not professional people, as women, generally aren't, something they struggle with. But I understand addiction is perhaps one of the most misunderstood diseases, and sex addiction in particular is the most misunderstood of addictions. So since no one else is out there teaching good information about sex addiction, I guess it's up to me to talk about it honestly, as I do have some unique insights into it as a former sex educator and pornographer and recovered sex addict. You see, sex is a human need. To live without it will make you mentally and physically ill. That makes us all predisposed to sex addiction in a sense. Yet, it doesn't automatically make us addicts, of course. What makes someone an addict of a thing is if they cannot go without it for very long, like over a day. Otherwise, they'll get unpleasant withdrawal symptoms that make it difficult for them to function normally because their brain has chemically adjusted to having that thing consistently. So it feels a need for it, and without it, you're going to have certain chemical deficits. And that causes some very unpleasant symptoms like getting physically ill, though the symptoms don't have to be limited to physical malaise. They can be and are most often psychological primarily, and will be things such as depression, anxiety, other terrible emotions such as angst or dread, insomnia, extreme mood swings, from one feeling to the next. Basically, some extremely bad mental health problems. And yes, these things can happen with sex addiction. When I was a sex addict, I needed to either get laid or masturbate to get my rocks off at least once or twice a day. And I needed to go out to do pickup at least every other day or so, every 3 days max. Otherwise, I would start to feel really bad psychologically. And it would literally have such symptoms as rooms appearing darker than they actually were, and me losing all of my energy and starting to feel, like not sick, but just uncomfortable and kind of crappy, really tired, needing to sleep more. These symptoms that I was an addict. And somehow none of my counselors ever picked up on this. They only ever addressed my drug addiction, even when that wasn't the problem for me. And sex addiction was currently my problem. They never pointed it out, which was really their job and not mine, since I didn't realize that I was a sex addict at the time because I didn't know anything about sex addiction because the psychologists and psychotherapists I had seen had never told me anything about it. You see, sex, and more generally speaking, women, were my drug of choice. Interacting with women is where I got my endorphin fix from. They were probably my main source of dopamine. And it wasn't just about getting laid either. I mean, it was about that, but not only that. For me, I wasn't just looking to get my rocks off. I was looking for female attention and validation as well. Having a hot girl show attraction for me is probably where I got most of my dopamine hits from. And this is because it wasn't really just sex I was addicted to. It was female affection as a whole. You see, there's a similar type of addiction that is related to sex addiction, and that is love addiction. You can actually get addicted to romance because it causes so many of these feel-good endorphins in your brain. You can get addicted to the emotional states that we call love and can fall in and out of love repeatedly, though it probably isn't real love, hence the quotes. This can cause you to get caught up in a pattern of what is called serial monogamy, where you jump from one committed relationship to the next without spending much time being single and working on yourself in between them. And also without taking your time in dating to date around and find the right partner for you, and then taking your time going steady with them and making sure you actually get to know them deeply and develop an intimate bond with them before getting into a committed relationship. Serial monogamists will do everything way too fast and early, professing their love, committing themselves, moving in together, getting married, and then ending it only to repeat the entire process over and over again in the time that it would normally take a healthy, well-adjusted person to still be recovering from their past heartbreak. And when this type of person does stay in a committed relationship for longer, it's often even worse than if they had left, because of the fact that it's not a healthy one, since they chose their partner quickly instead of carefully, and they didn't build a solid foundation for it slowly and steadily. All of which was done because, most of all, they aren't with their partner for the right reasons. These serial monogamous daters are only with their partners because they are what is called in psychology codependent. This means that they are not independent people. They have to depend upon others for things that they shouldn't have to, like their emotional well-being, validation and self-esteem, or even meeting basic needs. These people have mental health problems that make it hard for them to live on their own and fend for themselves emotionally and otherwise. So they become addicted to any people who they can depend upon for emotional support, love, romance, and care. This is the type of addict that I was, with a hyper focus on love and romance. The reason that I was this type of addict, and from my research this also goes for many others like me, is because when I was young and my brain was developing, I never got the love that a child needs from their parents for their brain to develop properly and be emotionally healthy. Rather the contrary. My parents were emotionally and physically abusive and caused me great traumas, which is what led me to have these types of mental health issues, such as attachment issues and codependency and sex and love addiction. You see, when we grow up not getting that type of love and care and support and nurturing from our family, who are the very people who are supposed to be giving it to us, which is a human need that all children have, you become a love-starved adult, and love becomes much more of a drug than it already is naturally, which it is inherently, because what we call love is actually just the experience of endorphins in the brain that are actual chemical drugs. So that's why they make us feel the way that we do, called love. So of course, those of us who don't get enough of the nurturing and thus the feel-good hormones that we need when our brains are developing, and thus have a deficit or deficiency of these, it causes us to become addicted to them as adults, and we end up chasing those feelings of love that we never got as a child and the great high that they cause us, constantly falling in and out of it with the plethora of people who we try to connect with. For love addicts like me, while I'll settle for casual sex, it just isn't very fulfilling, because it's like getting only a very low dose of our drug of choice, barely enough to even catch a buzz on, to really need it in its best possible form and in the highest possible doses. So casual sex and just getting my rocks off simply isn't enough. It's like not being able to get the good stuff, so you get a bag on the street corner only to find out that it's bunk and barely gets you high. What we love addicts need is someone to make epic love to us in order for our brains to synthesize a huge chemical cocktail that will take us all the way to cloud nine. Pure ecstasy. But unfortunately, due to a lack of good sex education and a very low animalistic level of consciousness and sexuality, most people are nowhere near at that level sexually to be able to provide this kind of experience, which makes this kind of thing, a very rare occurrence. And that in turn makes it a very difficult addiction to have. But I chased this great and elusive high for decades, going through innumerable women, only to find that most of them are not only completely lousy in bed and possess literally no sexual skills, many seemingly unable to contribute anything to the experience, but they were also incapable of things such as romance and even basic affection and human connection. And so sex with them was not the sensually indulgent experience that I'd hoped. Even when they liked me, obviously enough to have sex with me, they just didn't have much pleasure to give me. And I was doing pickup constantly, going through as many women as I could in order to get to the ones that I could actually connect with in the ways that I wanted. And I was talking to multiple girls every day, going on dates multiple times a week, having sex with a new girl every week or two when I was at the top of my game, only to be able to have the kinds of really epic sexual experiences I was looking for as little as a couple times a year. Most of the sex that I had was extremely unsatisfying, just disappointing, and left me sexually frustrated. Like, I would just kick the girl out and go right back out there to do more pickup and keep looking for someone who could hopefully engage with me more in the ways that I want. The rare occasions when I did have the kind of experience that I wanted, it would cause so many endorphins in my brain and such a great high that then the come down later would really suck. And if I actually fell in love with the person, I'd get, of course, even higher. But then when the codependent, addiction-based relationship didn't work out because it was terribly unhealthy, the come down that we call heartbreak was devastating. The greater the high, the greater the fall. This is why heartbroken men act the same way that someone who is addicted to hard drugs and sick when they can't get their fix acts. They stop being able to function because love is a drug. It provides the greatest high of all, which makes it the greatest come down and the greatest addiction. And why is that? Because it's not only a drug, but it is not just one drug. It is a combination of drugs, a very powerful drug cocktail with a synergistic effect in the brain, far more potent than anything you can get on the street. And yet, with all the warnings we received about drugs growing up, no one ever warned us about love. Rather, the opposite. We're taught to want it, that it is the greatest good in life, and to pursue it above all else. So, that's what I did. I chased it like the dragon that it is, and it brought me to ruin, just like heroin. However, most sex addicts aren't addicted to love like I was, but just the basic sensory pleasures of having their genitals stimulated by some form of sex act. So most sex addicts don't do pickup like I did to get their fix of female validation or try to look for love and enter into, those types of romantic relationships. But instead, they just get addicted to fucking sex workers. There are different kinds of these, and many addicts will focus in on a specific type, like getting addicted to strippers or escorts or massage therapists, as they call themselves, or whatever type it may be. There are types who are very specialized. There's high-class prostitutes, ones that have special skills, and then there's cheap crack whores on the corners. But regardless, an addict may focus on a specific type that they prefer, and they see sex as purely transactional and pay for it constantly, almost daily oftentimes, which can get quite expensive if they don't want to be fucking the dirty crack whores. But they don't care how much they have to pay for it, because another symptom of addiction is that the addict finds the thing they are addicted to taking over their life and their mind, controlling them and their thoughts, and causing them to lose control of themselves and their lives, which has negative consequences like going deep into debt or ending up in jail, which is what happened to me back when I was an alcoholic. Many drug addicts end up spending money they don't have on their drug of choice just to keep themselves from feeling like shit. And most sex addicts will do the same unless they're rich or a really good-looking guy or an exceptionally skilled PUA or a female. You see, good sex workers are expensive, costing hundreds of dollars per appointment. And so, unless you want to fuck cheap, ugly, disease-ridden crack whores, being a sex addict is an expensive habit. One that is more expensive than most vices and causes many men to go into debt, oftentimes to dangerous people like pimps and gangsters. And when you go into debt to fuel your addiction, that is when you know you have a serious problem, one that is causing your life to become out of control. We know that this is a sign of a problematic addiction that needs treatment. But if a man is doing this for just one woman whom he intends to marry or is already married to, and is going into debt in order to romance her and try to win her love or get her to have sex with him even, somehow this is not seen as a problem, but rather the opposite. It's seen as romantic. Yet, when a man is explicitly paying for sex and actually gets it from a woman in a more obvious transaction, he is labeled a criminal by the court of public opinion and thought of as sick. A John spending his money on a prostitute just to get laid is someone who has a problem. But if a guy is shelling out money for just one woman who is fleecing him while she plays hard to get and leads him on just so that she can mine him for as much gold as possible, society calls that romance for some paradoxical reason. Even if that relationship is codependent and the woman isn't healthy for him and is just a narcissist who's financially exploiting him and psychologically abusing him, this isn't seen as a problem. It's just an integral part of building a marriage. And this is why we need to have this brutally honest discussion on the true nature of sex addiction. Because technically, this scenario of a man trapped in a sexless marriage with a woman he's constantly trying to buy the affection of, or a man pursuing a woman who he wants to marry, who's playing hard to get and leading him on while accepting all kinds of monetary gestures and not even having sex with him at all, or is actually trading the sex for the monetary gestures, having sex with him when he commits a certain amount of money to her. These are still examples of both addiction and technically prostitution. In fact, I consider those forms of addiction to be far worse than the ones that I went through, being addicted to love, because these types of addiction don't even guarantee that they are going to get you laid, and you're still paying. At least I was getting my fix and didn't go into debt to try to buy a woman's affection. But many men do go into debt to try to buy a woman, and some of them may even invest a lot, only to discover that it's not enough and they still can't even have her. Instead of paying for an appointment with a sex worker, they spend exponentially more of their money, as well as their time and their energy and other resources, trying to get with a woman who they never get anywhere with because she was only leading them on. So they get no ROI, no happy ending of any kind, no sex, no love, no relationship, nothing but a waste of their resources that ends in heartbreak. Like, the only thing they have to show for it in the end is a broken fucking heart. And so that kind of addiction, to me, is an even more serious problem than the others, and something that no one's talking about. This phenomenon, as you may have already guessed, is what we today call simping. When you are pursuing and paying for a woman that is just constantly out of reach and who you never actually get, not in the way you want, not sexually or romantically, though. She may offer you friendship, which is basically you dating, but without the romance, and her having you fulfill the benefits of a boyfriend that she wants without giving you anything romantic in return. That is simping, investing a large amount of resources in a woman in an attempt to get her, and continuing to do this in spite of the fact that you are not, and she's giving you nothing. This is still indeed a form of sex addiction, or perhaps love addiction, since these men aren't technically getting sex, but are just doing it for some sort of emotional validation that is also sexual in nature. So what is it that they are paying for when they're shelling out so much money for a woman? What is the fix that they're getting if they aren't even getting laid? To sex addicts like myself who would actually have sex, this concept seems very alien, at least at first. But after some contemplation, I think I finally figured it out, and I think I really understand what the simp is actually doing. What it is they are settling for the lowest level of sexuality possible, which is the mere idea or notion of it. All that they are getting from these women that they are fraternizing with and trying to buy with their huge investments is the mere whiff of sexuality, a wafting of it, if you will. And they use that however they can to allow it to be enough to satisfy their desires, usually in a masturbatory fantasy. For you see, sex to them is so far out of reach that they know the closest they can get to it is some flirtatious attention from a girl, but probably no touching or any sort of physical sexual interaction. So they don't expect any more than just, this mere flirtatious attention. So a girl actually giving them a moment of her time and a few simple, nice words can be enough for a simp to then, take and go get his rocks off with by masturbating to the thought of her and whatever fantasy he's conjuring up. And he will even feel justified in having paid a lot for these few words that inspired his self-indulgent fantasy. So these simps will do things such as rewarding a girl financially just for sending them a couple of short text messages. These types of sex addicts are the opposite of the type that I was. I was on one end of the sex addiction spectrum and they were on the way other extreme. As a love addict, I needed to have the greatest, most ultimate form of sexual interaction with a woman in order to be satisfied. To put this into weed smoker terms for you, I was like that annoying weed snob who would only smoke primo flowers and no one else's weed was good enough for. And I'd only smoke it out of a really nice water pipe like this one, and I would chief it because of my high tolerance. And this is actually how I was, the same way I was with dating, and I still am kind of a weed snob. But a simp is the very opposite of that. In weed smoker terms, they would be like a kid who'd never tried it before. So if they were interested in weed, they would pay top dollar just to be around other people who were smoking so that they could get a whiff and potentially catch a contact high, but never even actually touch the stuff personally. A simp is a guy who will pay extravagant amounts of money just to have women acknowledge his existence momentarily. Their addiction is so extreme, they will literally pay thousands of dollars without even getting laid or having any kind of physical sexual contact whatsoever. They will do it just to have the girl give them the time of day for a little bit. That's it. Now, maybe many of these men are doing it because they see it as an investment in the future and are deluding themselves into thinking that these fleeting interactions could lead to something real someday. And maybe the girls are leading them on and are doing what is called in narcissism future faking, basically making them think that in order to get what they want from them. Either way, the simp isn't paying for any sort of actual physical sexual interaction. What they're paying for is simply an idea. So in my opinion, simps are some of the worst sex addicts of all. To throw away so much money on something that you never even get, to me, is indicative of one of the worst problems when it comes to addiction. It's more similar to gambling addiction than drug addiction, actually. Or if it was a drug addict, it would be like when you were so desperate for a drug that if someone tells you they can get it for you, but you have to front them the money, they just willingly, gratefully do it, only to later kick themselves when the person never comes through with the drugs, and yet continue to do it repeatedly. And say thank you while being grateful for it all along. This is something that a lot of drug addicts have gone through, and yet when it does happen to you, you don't give the person more money in the future, and you'll usually stop allowing that happen to you with anyone, but not the simps. The simps just keep on handing out free money to women who give them next to nothing in return. Even if it causes them crippling debt, they just cannot stop because it is a compulsion. It is, in fact, an addiction, a disease. That is the nature of addiction. Wait a minute. Now a word from our sponsor, me. Do you value the ability to use words to do things such as compose meaningful sentences and speak the truth? Did you know that here in this great country of America, you have the right to free speech? And so do I. And if you don't support people who are exercising that right, then you are probably a fascist dictator. Just like the YouTube algorithm, which stifles the content of patriotic people like me who dare to speak out against the gynocentric, matriarchal, feminist regime that has been aggressively taking over our country. And if YouTube isn't going to promote my content and is going to suppress it instead, I can only rely upon you, my viewers, to show your support. If you don't support free speech, we will stop having it. Which is exactly what is already happening with YouTube videos that censor themselves getting promoted and explicit ones like mine getting shadow banned. So, if you like listening to me use my free speech, make sure to press like and share and donate whatever you can with the PayPal link below. Don't make me work for free and get censored like a fucking communist. And with the presidential election coming up, your donations can literally be used to fund my campaign to get into the White House and abolish the matriarchy once and for all. Literally. Who would you rather have as your president? An old limp-dick liberal leftist cuck with noodly arms who's probably never been in a real fight in his life? Or a good old-fashioned, misogynistic, patriarchal man's man like me with balls big enough to stand up to women? And who you can count on to speak out against them and tell it like it is. Fight the feminazi dictatorship. Spread the message of masculinism. Keep my work alive. And now, back to our regularly scheduled content. And another thing you need to know about addiction is that how just like the drug addict is funding drug dealers, who are usually some of the worst scum in society and who cause certain problems in society, i.e. crime, so too does the simp support women who become just as scummy as these drug dealers and go on to be just as problematic for society, as we are now beginning to see with this toxic culture of narcissistic female influencers and porno girls. These girls could not exist if it weren't for a whole simp economy that they rely upon for their lifeblood. And the social issues that this simping economy is causing in female nature and in the sexual marketplace are great. You see, when a simp starts offering women money for nothing, these women then believe that they are entitled to this kind of money from men. These women then become narcissistic and toxic and manipulative and abusive towards men, treating them as servants who are beneath them and exploiting them for monetary gains, dehumanizing them in the process. There is an epidemic of male simps these days, which has led to an epidemic of overly entitled, narcissistic, sociopathic female predators. All of these women that we see on social media who claim that a man must make exorbitant sums of money and monetary contributions to them in order to be an eligible suitor for them were made that way by simps. Think of it this way. It's like if you won the lottery and you got $5,000 off of just one lottery ticket, the most money you've ever made in a day. So you said to yourself, well, now I know my worth. I'm worth $5,000 a day. So now I know that's how much money I should be making at a job. And then you went out and started applying for jobs that were way above your pay grade, but you were acting like you were overqualified for the position in spite of it actually being way out of your league. This is exactly what has happened with modern women due to simping. Simps sending women thousands of dollars for no good reason. It was like them winning the lottery, but thinking that they deserved it and that they were somehow owed this, and then taking on that sort of entitled attitude. And that's what we see now on like whatever in the Fresh and Fit podcast with all these girls going on acting like they think they're the queen of the fucking world, all because of simps. And so because of those simps making those big unnecessary monetary contributions to these small-minded women, these women are now pricing themselves way outside of the dating pool. And suddenly no man is ever going to be rich enough or good enough for them, and all they can then bring themselves to do is to act like some form of prostitute and go and get an OnlyFans account and start demanding exorbitant sums from men just to give them some little token of affection, like a nice pre-programmed text message or something. And so in effect, simping has completely screwed up the sexual marketplace and the whole dating economy. It has inflated the cost of women so much that even women who are actually quite low value are placing an extremely high price tag on themselves, and to act as though they are very high status in spite of the fact that they aren't classy at all and can't even speak properly or act civilized in many cases and are only capable of acting like degenerates because that's what they are. It's caused below average women to act like they aren't, but are princesses or even goddesses, like they're the queens of their own fucking planet, because it seems they do actually live in their own fucking world. They act like they're entitled to things from men and types of men that they simply aren't. And it's caused an epidemic of toxic and downright evil female behavior towards men that is exploitative, dehumanizing, inhumane, and immoral. It is a type of behavior that men should not have to put up with. Men should not be treated like slaves. It's like simps have volunteered themselves to act like slaves and servants, so women suddenly think that they're queens and princesses and goddesses, and that all men are their slaves and servants, right? And so it causes them to act in a way that is highly prejudicial and discriminatory and what is called misandrist or sexist against men. And it has all been propagated by simps because of their insanely rampant addiction to female attention. So this is why, in my personal opinion, out of all of the types of sex addiction, simping is the absolute worst form of the disease. I'd even go as far as to say that because of the huge and widespread social issues it is causing the rest of society, simping is a pandemic that almost deserves a class of its own as a disease, with its own special rehabilitation programs for men who have fallen prey to it, and addiction education programs in schools for adolescent boys who are starting to experience sex hormones and are in danger of falling victim to it. We need to inoculate them against it, just like we did with the DARE program back in the 90s, though that wasn't successful. However, all kidding aside, there are still other forms of sex addiction that I need to address, and other extremes that it can go to that I want to talk about. In recent history, we started seeing some information come out about a new form of addiction called porn addiction. This is quite different from the types of sex addiction I've talked about so far, because most of the people who get addicted to porn are looking for an easy and highly effective solo way to fuel their addiction. Most of them don't want to have to pay to get their rocks off, or invest any amount of time or energy into it either, or bothering trying to relate with another human being sexually. That stuff's hard. So just like I do these days, these guys get their sexual needs satisfied through the use of free online pornography, which is of course the easiest way to get your fix as a sex addict. However, if you know anything about addiction, you know that it often starts with what is called a gateway drug, something that is easy to get into, and porn is the gateway drug of sex addiction. The ease and efficiency of pornography can lead one through a downward spiral into some depraved extremes, such as using it several times a day until you are collectively spending several hours each day masturbating, which happens in part because the more you do it, the harder it becomes to climax and finish. Some addicts may end up chasing orgasms that never even come because after hours of masturbation, their penis starts to hurt. One of the things that also makes it harder to climax is fetishization, which can easily happen with porn. When we first start using porn, general pictures of naked women are enough, even if they're soft core or just of the boobs. Remember when you were a teenager and you first discovered that stuff? And it just didn't take much to get your rocks off, right? But then after that, we start to explore all of our options. And so then we start to focus in on different ones more and more. We start to focus in first on more explicit images, right? We don't want just boobs, we want pussy too. And we want things to be less soft core, all right? We want all their clothes off. We want to be able to see everything, and we want them to get into sexual positions, right? And then we want higher definition images. Then we want images of women who meet more specific preferences, such as Latinas, Asians, teens, blondes, redheads, MILFs, or whatever demographic you might be interested in. Then we move from images to videos. Then we need the videos to be longer. Then we need the videos to be more explicit. Then we need the videos to be in point of view so that we can imagine ourselves in the scene firsthand. And then we need the videos to become more hardcore. And then we need them to become more kinky, more interesting, more extreme, more of a fantasy. Then we focus in on specific sex acts and toys and types of fantasies. And as we continue to specialize our sexual interests more and more and intensify our stimulation, what happens is that we develop what are called fetishes. And as we focus on them more and more exclusively and stop focusing on other things, they become a fixation. And if we don't stop then, they become the most powerful addiction of all. What a fetish is an addiction to a very specific type of sex act that one absolutely needs in order to climax or even experience arousal or any sensual pleasure at all for some people. Other forms of sexual stimulation will barely register in the fetishist's nervous system. Once addicted to a fetish, we will need that thing just to get hard or experience orgasm. And anytime our fetish is not being indulged enough or in the right way, we may not get sexually stimulated enough to feel pleasure or even arousal. And instead, we may start to experience sexual dysfunction and the frustration that can go along with it. For instance, we may not always be able to come very easily, which is a sexual dysfunction called anorgasmia. And we men can also experience another form of sexual dysfunction that can be quite humiliating and women have, very little compassion for, called erectile dysfunction. I know every guy out there knows just how frustrating that can be. And so what the fetishist does in order to fight these things and prevent our sexual dysfunction and frustration is we have to ramp up the indulgence in the fetish and make it even more stimulating by making it more hardcore, intensifying it in whatever ways that we can. This is exactly what happens with people who get into extreme fetishes like BDSM, which is exactly what happened to me. I went from PUA to love addiction to fetishization and hardcore BDSM. Once I became a dom, sex had to be kinky and hardcore, and I had to have my fetish indulged consistently throughout the sex act. And if a girl I was fucking with went without using my fetishes or doing anything kinky to stimulate me, for more than a moment or so, I would start to lose interest and lose my erection. This was a problem, and not just for my pride, but it also hurt my performance professionally when I became a pornographer and started making hardcore porn for profits, since I wasn't just having sex for my own pleasure anymore, and I was supposed to be doing it for the camera as a performance to get paid for, and that just simply wasn't enough to keep my sex organ motivated. So I had to go to the doctor and ask for Viagra and literally medicate myself just so that I could perform in ways that weren't my own personal fetish. So people like me who follow the downward spiral of sex addiction all the way down to the very rock bottom they often end up in this kind of place. They require a very specific type of sex act or sex toy or porn or fantasy or kinky fetish of some sort in order for them to feel anything. And if this sounds outlandish to you, let me just tell you, people can easily get addicted to things like the feeling of their favorite toy, to the point where they just get into the habit of using it every time that they are trying to get off. And after doing that consistently for a while, nothing else will do it for them, especially if over time they are turning up the power level on the toy as they're using it and making it more and more intense, right? Or if it's a toy that their partner uses on them, like they have their partner use it with more force or pressure or whatever. People can even get addicted to things such as sexual pain, and can then end up needing pain in order to experience pleasure, quite ironically. But like, a lot of girls will find that they enjoy being spanked and ask for it to get harder and harder over time, and then want to switch to something like a paddle, and then want to switch to something even more painful like a cane or a whip, and you can get fixated on any toy when you do this, right? And get addicted to anything that you fixate on for too long at the exclusion of all else, especially when you've been intensifying how you use it exponentially over long periods of time. So when one starts using various toys that are technologically engineered to create supernatural stimulation, especially ones where the stimulation can be adjusted to different levels of intensity, like vibrators, and thus can be steadily increased over time, our addiction can become more and more extreme over time as we develop a tolerance to lower levels of stimulation and have to keep amping it up in order to get the same pleasure. In fact, in the BDSM world, there are people who are called masochists, which means that they derive pleasure from acts of pain. And they can get addicted to all sorts of different types of painful toys and acts, and what are called sexual punishments or punishments, like being whipped or beaten with a paddle or cane. For the hardcore masochistic fetish addicts, they may need this to be done in a certain way, like with their favorite whips or paddles. They'll oftentimes have a craving for pain where they'll need it to be done with the one that hurts the most, and for it to be done as intensely as possible and by someone who knows how to do it that way, who's extremely skilled in it and can do it just right for them. And in some cases, when they may be asking for it to be done as hard as possible, they can get to the point of it causing actual physical injury. And I've even heard of cases of women dying before because they were beaten all over their back and their internal organs, and it was causing internal bleeding. And so this is why this type of thing is actually technically illegal, and in the eyes of the law counts as felony sexual assault, even with consent. Since a woman cannot legally consent to something the law has deemed to be abuse and has made illegal. But people who are addicted to this stuff, can't be bothered with the law about it, of course. And in the years I spent in the BDSM community, surrounded by these types of fetish addicts, and in the porn industry as well, I met countless people who were addicted to countless different fetishes. Many of them had more than one, in fact. And each one needed to have their fetish satiated almost daily in order to avoid sexual frustration and withdrawal symptoms, like severe depression and such. And each of these people's sexual needs were so grand and so specific as well that they were, of course, nearly impossible to fill, just like mine were. So sexual frustration is always imminent for a fetish addict. This is what happens when someone reaches the rock bottom with sex addiction. They find themselves among a lot of other addicts looking for anyone who they can find who might be able to satiate your desires for something so hardcore that your ability to find someone willing to do it is going to be very rare. And the guys like this who can afford it may end up paying some specialized sex work professional to do it for them, like some sort of dominatrix or something like that, only to oftentimes still be unfulfilled and frustrated afterwards. And just like how fat people who are unhealthy food addicts who binge eat will enable themselves with talking about body positivity, people who are sexual fetishists in the sexual sewer we call the kink community, they do the same thing with talking about what is called sex positivity, which basically means that they enable themselves to be so depraved as to be addicted to these hardcore fetishes by ignoring the idea of addiction as something that is shameful, and ignoring all of the other negative symptoms that are associated with it as well, and trying to just keep a positive attitude towards any type of sexuality, any form of it, any fetish or whatever. But in reality, most of these people just simply demand that their own fetishes get respected while shaming certain others that they find disgusting or aversive. And just like a drug addict ignoring all the negatives of their drug, only focusing on those few fleeting positive moments of high that they get here and there, in spite of the fact that the rest of the time everything is totally shitty. The same thing happens with sex addicts, be it codependent love addicts, simps, hardcore porn addicts, or fetish addicts alike. We're all sex addicts of some type that have enabled our addiction by ignoring the negatives, ignoring our descent into depravity in order to focus on fleeting highs when we can get our fix. Even as our addiction to these acts, and in this case these people, these harlots, wreaks havoc on our mental health, our physical health, our financial health, and other aspects of our lives, we make excuses and enable ourselves through poor thinking and delusion. We keep chasing good feelings that we can never hold on to. And at some point, we have just got to sober up and stop ourselves before we hit rock bottom. And things become so bad that we've done damage that can never be undone, like getting an STD or rewiring your brain to be pretty much incapable of producing its own dopamine and experiencing any pleasure in life at all. We need to learn that the sex hormones that our brain produces are drugs. That's why sex feels so good. If you've had an orgasm, you've just gotten as high as if you had used a hard drug. So we're all potential sex addicts. And some of us may already be addicts and not even know it. We need to start regarding sexual pleasure the same way we do with other drugs and vices. Don't let yourself get sucked into that downward spiral. Just like any vice, sex should be kept in moderation. If you need to get your rocks off every day, that could be okay for some people. Just don't let yourself get fixated on any extreme forms of stimulation. Avoid what are called supernormal stimuli. So avoid hardcore porn, avoid BDSM and kinky fetishes, avoid hardcore fantasies, avoid falling in love with seductive women who may not love you, and especially avoid allowing it to happen hard and fast and causing you to enter into codependent relationships and even a whole pattern of serial monogamy. Avoid paying women exorbitant sums, no matter who she is, whether she's a high-class whore or a gold-digging fiance. Using porn is okay, but make sure you also use your imagination too sometimes. Otherwise, you'll stop having one. And make sure you abstain some days and take a day off from jerking off here and there. If we keep our sexual pleasures in moderation, it will just be much healthier for us, and we will also stop ourselves from becoming numb to sexual stimuli and needing to constantly amp up the extremity of it until only hardcore kinky fetishes are what arouses us. And if you know any guys who may be in danger of some form of sex addiction, please send them this video. Saving men from simping and sex addiction can actually mean saving the whole sexual marketplace and the entire future of dating. That concludes this video. Thanks for listening. I hope I mansplained that good enough for you. If you like what you heard, please click the like button. And if you feel you gained some value from this video and would like to give some back, please do so with the PayPal link below, because your support helps fund me doing this work and fight the good fight for men like you. If you are ready to take the red pill and wake up from the matrix and the matriarchy controlling it and learn everything you need to know about female-on-male sexism, get your copy of my newly released book called Misandry Exposed, on sale now for a special price that won't last long, so check it out by clicking the link below. And otherwise, you can stay tuned for the next video coming out tomorrow, which will be on dealing with depression. And until then, take care of yourselves, men, because no woman out there is going to.